Anyone has any?
How was your weekend?
Oh, the weekend was pretty good. How about yours?
Mine was pretty all right. Played some disc golf. Got
Oh,
outside. That was pretty nice.
no, that's good. That's good. So, yeah, I guess right now everyone is staying home as much as possible to avoid the getting in contact with other people, I guess.
Yeah.
Part of social distancing, but still, I mean, we have to continue to do what we have to do. I mean, life doesn't stop just because of the coronavirus. I mean, we have to keep on living, I guess. And some have decided to do a little bit of that, whereas others have decided to completely stay at home and avoid the unnecessary contacts. Anyway, it is what it is. Okay, so any other questions before we start?
Nope.
Okay. So today what we're going to do is we're going to start with chapter 2, which deals with economic performance and the social outcomes in the MENA region as a whole from 1960 to about 2010. That's the time period that we're using to actually pinpoint the challenges, the weaknesses, the progress, the advances that some of these countries and the regions were able to make, and also the challenges that each country faced. But before we do that, we're going to divide the MENA region into 3 groups. And we're going to call them the RRLP, resource-rich, labor-poor countries, RRLA, resource-rich, labor-abundant, and RPLA, resource-poor, labor-abundant. So if you look at the MENA region, they're probably close to maybe about 19 or 20 countries altogether. Some of them are well endowed with labor, but very few resources. So we're going to call those the RPLA. Others are endowed with a lot of resources, but very little labor. And we're going to call those the resource-rich, labor-poor. And then, of course, we have those countries that are pretty much abundant in both resources and also labor. However, if you compare the resource-rich, labor-abundant with the resource-rich, labor-poor, you find that usually the resource-rich, labor-poor do a lot better in terms of economic growth, in terms of standard of living, etc. And the reason is simply because they have all of that wealth to divide it between a smaller population size, which is an advantage. But we will talk about that. So these are the 3 categories that we're going to be using when it comes to trying to determine the economic performance in the MENA region. So we're going to lump countries into those 3 separate groupings. Now, if we look at the resource-rich, labor-poor, those will be Morocco. I'm sorry, the resource-rich, labor-poor will be the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which consists of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain. Those are the 6 countries that are members of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. In other words, it's like, for example, the NAFTA, which includes the US, Canada, and Mexico. They have all joined together into one regional trade bloc. It's very, very similar to the GCC. The GCC countries decided that they want to form their own economic bloc, so to speak. They were pretty much successful, by the way, in forming that trading and economic bloc. It still needs a lot of refurbishing. It still needs a lot of work in terms of free trade regulations, in terms of capital movement, in terms of common external tariffs. They're still not there yet, but they're trying. They're trying to pursue a goal, if you will, or an objective that will ultimately lead to a complete economic as well as a political union. But as I said, they still have a lot of work to do. But I think, right now they're moving in the right direction, and they were able actually to achieve a lot of the economic outcomes that they aspired for. But as I said, they can do better. So those are basically the resource-rich labor poor. Now, sometimes we include Libya with them. And the reason is simply because Libya is well endowed with resources, but the population of Libya is very small. I mean, if you look at Libya as a country, it's a huge country, probably about 1.7 million square kilometers. That's the area of Libya, which is probably 5 times the size of Britain. So the land is huge, but population-wise, it's only about 6 million people inhabit that huge geographical area. So we tend to lump Libya with the GCC. Now, Libya, of course, is not a member of the GCC, but the author happens to put Libya part of the resource-rich labor poor. So you have the GCC countries and Libya. Those countries come under the resource-rich labor poor. And then you have the resource-rich labor abundant countries. Now in that category, we're gonna be including countries such as Iraq, Iran, Algeria, Sudan, and sometimes even Syria is included, even though sometimes, I don't like to include Syria as part of the resource-rich, labor-abundant, but I guess your author includes Syria in that category as well. So those are basically the countries that happen to be resource-rich, labor-abundant. So again, you have Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Iran, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see if those are the actual I think it's on page, I guess, page, let's see the page here. Yes, on page, let's see here, page 27 of your book. I guess you can see the resource-rich, labor-poor countries are Bahrain, Kuwait, Libya, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 countries happen to be under resource-rich, labor-poor. Again, this is on page 27 of your textbook. And then you have the resource-rich, labor-abundant. Okay, you have Algeria, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Now, I tend to disagree with the author, but nevertheless, we're going to go with whatever the author has here for now, in terms of including Syria and Yemen under resource-rich, labor-abundant. I think those really belong to the other category, but anyway. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries in the resource-rich, labor-abundant. Then we look at the resource-poor, labor-abundant countries, and this include Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Palestine, and Tunisia. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they're pretty much evenly divided into, 3 categories, with each category having about 6 countries, except the first one, which has 7. So we have 6 and 6, 12, 12 and 7, 19. So all in all, we're talking about 19 countries in the MENA region that hopefully we will have a chance to talk about them in terms of groupings, if you will, because talking about each country, that's time consuming, and it would be extremely difficult to cover each country in isolation. Now, sometimes, we tend to refer to, just to give examples, to refer to specific countries, but usually our mode of analysis will probably cover these countries in terms of the groupings that they belong to. Now, what we want to do here, of course, today is first, we want to explore the economic growth in the region, as I said, from 1960 to 2010. That's basically the objective. We want to look at the economic growth performance of the region during that period. And we want to show how it differed over time and across the region. So over time, was the region doing better or doing worse or doing the same? Or what happened during that time period from 1960 to 2010? And also we want to look at the regions themselves and compare them. Which region did the best and which region did the worst in terms of economic performance? And then we will look at the transition that occurred during that period. And the transition obviously occurred in the 1980s, from 1980 to about, I would say, 1986 to 1996. It's a complete decade, 10 years, 1986 to 1995. And usually that period is referred to as the lost decade. And that's basically when you had a lot of structural adjustments, a lot of transitions in the economies. And because of that, a lot of the things were put at a standstill. Now, my question is, and hopefully we will try to answer it, not in this chapter, but in the subsequent coming chapters. Why did the structural adjustment or the transition period took so long? Why did it take 10 years? That's a long, long time. And you will see from dissecting or analyzing the way that the MENA region functions or performs. I don't know if this is cultural, historical. I can't pinpoint the exact reasoning for it, but I feel that they have no sense of time. Time doesn't play a role. It's not a factor. They don't look at time as a resource. So, to them, taking 3 years, 4 years, 7 years, 8 years to make changes is normal. I mean, sometimes I feel like there is really no one pushing decision makers or public policy makers in that region to move, to do something. I mean, things sometimes stay frozen for many, many years without anyone paying any attention to it. And this really has to do with governance, basically, as we will see later on. It's part cultural, part governance. I mean, there are so many combinations that goes into that region, really not trying to perform and function in a way that is efficient and in a way that is timely. So time never enters into the equation. And this is a big, big problem. But we will see that as we go along. So that's basically what we want to do in this chapter. Now, we also want to focus on the 3 phases of development. So you have the first phase of development. In other words, most of these countries got their independence in the 1960s. Most of them, 60s and early 70s. Now, some of them, of course, got their independence in the 40s. And some of them, obviously, like Saudi Arabia, for example, they were never colonized. Basically, the whole country was never colonized. Now, bits and pieces of it was colonized under Turkish rule, but most of the country, Saudi Arabia, was kept intact under tribal Bedouin rule, which we will talk about it when we get to it. But most other Arab countries were obviously colonized and invaded, either by the Turks, and after the Turks, of course, they were occupied by Western powers. So you have France, Britain, and Italy, all slicing the remains of the Turkish Empire between them. So Britain got a few countries, France got other countries, and Italy got some countries as well. So in other words, these 3 Western powers, Italy, France, and Britain, happened to be the countries that dominated most of the MENA region. And as I said, the MENA region, most of them got their independence in the 60s and early 70s. As I said, some of them in the 40s and 50s, but mostly in the 60s. So by, I would say, 1966, 68, most countries in the region were pretty much independent, sovereign, in other words. So we will look at these three phases of development, which the first phase obviously occurred right after this region got its independence from Western colonizers. So you're talking about from 1960 to maybe 1975, 1980, somewhere around there, you had the first phase of development, which is usually referred to as the ISI, import substitution industrialization. In other words, this is a strategy that was followed by these countries in order to give a huge shot to their economies. In other words, they felt that in order to grow rapidly and in order to make inroads, if you will, in as far as progress is concerned and advances are concerned, the best strategy for them, according to the policymakers at the time, was to embark on an ISI strategy, import substitution industrialization strategy. In other words, they wanted to focus on manufacturing, basically, on industrializing their economies, because when they first started, most of these economies were pretty much or purely agricultural and rural in nature. Very little urbanization, very little industrialization. It was mostly dependent on farming, agriculture, and most of the areas were pretty much rural areas. You don't see much development. You don't see much urbanization. Even though, you know, some of the colonial powers, France, Italy, and Britain, each one to a certain degree, to a certain limit, were able to contribute to the urbanization of these countries. But they didn't do a whole lot. In other words, they felt that these countries served as a market for their products. And as a result, they did not spend too much time trying to industrialize these countries because it was not in their interest to do so, simply because they wanted these countries to continue import manufactured goods from them. And they wanted these countries to continue grow food, in other words, focus on agricultural products, farming products, if you will, so that these countries can actually import their food requirements at a very cheap price from these colonies. And this was exactly the strategy. But as I said, once these countries got their independence, they wanted to change this strategy and they wanted to start to industrialize their economies, to put their economies on an industrial footing, because they felt that was the way to prosperity, economic prosperity, the way to making progress, advances, etc. And then, of course, this was the first phase, and this is exactly what most of these countries embarked on. And then the second phase was known as the structural adjustment phase. That's when a lot of these countries wanted to change from this strategy, ISI, to a new strategy, which is known as the export-led growth strategy. In which case, of course, because there were a lot of problems that ISI created for these countries. And at the beginning, it was doing wonders. It was working extremely well. But at the later stages of this strategy, a lot of these countries found it to be wasteful, found it to be squandering their resources, in a way that is inefficient. And usually, you know, when things first start, at the beginning, you see them always, you know, doing very, very well. But at the end, you know, they start to languish, I guess, and a lot of contradictions begin to appear. Usually the contradictions, they don't appear from the beginning. It takes time for them to filter in. And that's usually what happens with a lot of strategies. When you first start them, you know, they're doing pretty well, and they sound efficient, or they appear to be efficient. But after a while, a lot of the contradictions that happen to be part and parcel of these strategies begin to show. And this is exactly what happened with ISI in many of the countries in the region. So because of that, they decided to shift gears, I guess, change from ISI to a new strategy known as the export-led growth strategy, which we will talk about in just a few minutes. Now, in the meantime, of course, we had this transition period, or the structural adjustment phase. When we went from ISI to export-led growth, we did not go automatically, directly, immediately from one strategy to another. There was a gap between the two strategies. And that gap is known as the structural adjustment period, or the period of transition. And as I said, unfortunately, it took 10 years for that period to actually come to a close, the structural adjustment. And again, we will also talk about that in just a minute. But this is basically what we want to do. First, we want to look at the performance, the economic performance of the region from 1960 to 2010. And obviously, all those three phases are included in that time period from 1960 to 2010. In other words, the ISI, the structural adjustment, and the export-led growth. All those are part and parcel of that 1960 to 2010. Now, if you look at the long-term performance of the region, in other words, from 1960 to 2010, that's a pretty long period. So if you look at the long-term performance of the region, you can see that it has been a little short of stellar. In other words, they were doing extremely well because on the average, the MENA region was growing at about 4.9% per year for all those years from 1960 to 2010. And that's a pretty good growth rate for the region. So it's a reasonably solid performance by both historical and international standards. And you can actually see it, why it is such a stellar performance, by simply comparing it to the growth rates in Africa during that period. Africa was growing at 3.5% on average. Latin America was growing at 3.8%. South Asia was growing at 5%. And Southeast Asia was growing at 7.3%. So if you look at the MENA region, they were not doing that poorly. I mean, when you compare them with the rest of the world, they were pretty much right there, with the exception, of course, of Southeast Asia was doing extremely well at 7.3%. But other than that, the rest of the world, the MENA region was right there with them. And you can see that there is a lot of economic, political, and social diversity among the three groups. So even though we happen to show that the region as a whole grew at 4.9% on a whole, but you can see that different regions grew at different rates. Why? Because of the diversity in both economic resources, in social diversity, political diversity. Not all regions happen to be governed by similar political systems. So there is huge diversity there. You have countries that are kingdom, and you have countries that are republics. You have countries that are pretty much capitalist. You have other countries that are socialist. You have countries that are, middle of the road. So, there is a huge diversity in the MENA region and their economic structures and their political structure. And there is also a lot of social diversity, different ethnic groups, different religions. So again, when I look at the MENA region, I think they're really blessed with this diversity, especially when it comes to social diversity. However, they have not been able to actually take advantage of this huge diversity that they have. Other countries have done pretty well. A good example would be the USA. United States of America has done extremely well with this huge ethnic diversity in both religion and ethnicity, by the way. So, the thing is, in America here, they were able to come to grips with this diversity and call themselves Americans, whereas in the MENA region, a lot of countries happen to be pretty much nationalistic. You're either Libyan or Lebanese or Algerian or Syrian or Iraqi, and all these different countries happen to show that they have different identities, and they simply are not ready to move together in one front. They simply have different goals, different agendas, different aspirations, and I'm talking more of the governments than the people themselves, because if the people were left to their own aspirations and to their own thinking, I think things probably might have been a little bit better. But even though with this all political infighting and all this tribal and ethnic and religious infighting, they have not been able to actually get together and agree on some common goals that will make those countries prosper and make people of all ethnicities, religion, backgrounds, whatever, all prosper. And this is the problem that the region is facing right now. Now it has led to a lot of civil wars in certain countries. It has led to a lot of infighting, social strife, and not enough time is given to the actual problems that need to be addressed. And that's economic reforms, political reforms. So these problems are taking the back seat to the ethnic quarrels, religious quarrels, etc. And as I said, that's one of the main problems that the region is facing right now. So there is a lot of economic, political, and social diversity among the three groups. Economic performance in terms of GDP growth is recorded for the resource-rich labor poor to be about 5.6% per year. For the resource poor, labor abundant, it's about 5.3, and the resource rich, labor abundant, 4.4. So you can see the ranking of the MENA region, and as far as the groupings are concerned in terms of economic performance, as first RRLP, second RPLA, distant third RRLA, resource rich, labor abundant. Now you may ask the question, how is it that resource poor, labor abundant are doing a lot better than the resource rich, labor abundant? Anyone has any answer to that? If you read the second chapter, probably you might have gotten some pointers as to why that is the case. Anyone? Just
Wait, what was the question? Could you rephrase it?
yeah, the question is, why is the resource poor, labor abundant outperformed the resource rich, labor abundant? Resource poor outperforming.
It's because of the oil. It's because of the oil. They relied on the oil too much, and once the economy crashed or something like that, the countries like Saudi Arabia were too dependent on oil. So they were like at 10%, like their economic growth like increased by like 10%. But once it hit like the 1970s or 80s, something happened, and it caused the countries that were reliant on oil to go down with like unemployment, and oil prices went down and all that good stuff.
Yeah, you have a point there, but the thing is,
the fundamental basis of the economy is more reliant on natural resources rather than the products of the people. So it's more susceptible and vulnerable to supply shocks.
Yeah, both of you, I guess, are thinking in the same way, and you do have some credence in that. But the thing is, here we're talking about growth rates over the long haul from 1960 to 2010 on the average. So obviously, we can forget about the cyclical effects that oil had, because here we're talking about the long-term growth, the average long-term growth. And that tells me that over the long haul, the resource poor, labor abundant, did much better than the resource rich, labor abundant. But they did worse, or not much worse, than the resource rich, labor poor.
Would it be small business formation and the formation of a middle class?
Very good, that's one, absolutely. The resource poor, labor abundant were actually able to expand their economy a lot more by opening up the doors for private investors. In other words, their economies was more tuned towards a market economy rather than a socialist economy. So you have countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Tunis, Morocco. All of these are market economies, basically. And all of these, they pretty much focused on producing goods that they have a comparative advantage in. They weren't too much focusing on the ISI, and also the structural adjustment period for them was a lot shorter than it was for the resource-rich, labor-abundant. So those are basically some of the reasons. And then, of course, when it comes to the form of government also, the form of government that existed in the RPLA helped the economies to move a lot more dynamically than the countries that were obviously governed by absolute dictators. usually military dictators. So those are some of the reasons why. So on one hand, you had a much shorter structural adjustment phase. You had a lot of more private investors participating in the economy. And also you had these countries not put all their eggs in one basket in the ISI strategy, but rather they stuck to the production of goods that they had a comparative advantage in. Regardless, if it was in agriculture, then they would continue to do that in farming, in food processing, small factories, rather than going really huge from the beginning. Huge, big industries, big manufacturing plants. No, they didn't take that strategy, but they rather focused on light manufacturing, small factories, producing food, processing goods, etc. So, you know, so those basically the reasons why the resource poor, labor abundant did better than the resource rich, labor abundant countries. Okay. Now, if we look at the GDP measured in current US dollars, 2010, for the three groups, you see that the resource rich, now remember, each group has about 6 countries, except, you know, the resource rich labor poor, which has 7 countries. But the other ones, they have 6 and 6, which is very close. But look at the GDP of the resource rich labor poor. It's 1.2 trillion. The resource rich labor abundant is 460 billion. Resource poor labor abundant, 423. So there isn't really that much difference between the RPLA and the RRLA. If you look at their GDPs, very, very similar. Even though the resource rich, you know, they have a lot of oil and they're selling a lot of oil. The resource poor, they really have no oil, but you can see that their GDP is pretty much similar. And that's big question mark why that is. Especially when you see that in the resource rich labor abundant, you have 3 countries that are supposed to be one of the biggest industrial powers in the region, like Iraq, Iran, and Algeria. A lot of hope was put onto these 3 countries to actually make the region move faster economically, simply because of their huge land resources, oil, and labor resources. They're pretty much abundant in all of that: land, labor, and natural resources, oil. So, I mean, what else do you need? You got all the ingredients. Now, why are you not doing so well? That's a problem. If you look at the RRLP, well, obviously they have a lot of oil, very few people. And in terms of land, most of the land is really not arable land. Most of it is desert, especially when you look at Saudi Arabia and also Libya. Most of that land is harsh desert, basically. So I would say only 10% is arable land out of that 100%. Only 10% is arable. The rest is desert, harsh desert. And, but still, you can see the difference right there. So they must be doing something right that the other regions are not. And this is something that we want to look into in much more details. So economic growth in the region becomes rather modest when we take into account population growth. Why? Because when we take into account population growth, we see that growth or GDP per capita is rather small compared to other countries. And the reason is simply because of population growth. Population growth in the MENA region has been extremely rapid. In other words, on the average, population growth in the MENA region is about 2.7% per year on the average, which is really the highest in the world. So population is growing very, very rapidly. And this is, by the way, what's keeping the per capita GDP very low for the labor abundant countries. It's very high for the labor poor, like the GCC and Libya. But for the other countries where population is very high, then obviously GDP per capita growth has been extremely low. So even though growth of GDP has been remarkable by all standards for the MENA region, however, per capita GDP growth has been very low compared to other countries. So, okay, let's look at the three phases of development. Let's start with the ISI strategy. And you can see the ISI started from 1960 to about 1983. And, excuse me. You can see that the main purpose of the ISI is simply to move traditional economies to an industrial footing, like I said before, by simply engaging in the production of manufacturing products for local markets under some trade protection, because you have to have trade protection in order for the ISI strategy to succeed. And this is, well, it is hoped anyway, that this strategy will simply help the region escape what we call the agrarian trap, poverty trap. In other words, a lot of these countries felt that they have been simply focusing on farming and agricultural activities for so long, and this really has not done anything for them. In other words, it has not improved their standard of living for the simple reason, because usually if you look at productivity or the marginal product of labor in agricultural areas is a much, much lower than the marginal product of labor in industrial sectors. And because marginal product is very low, wages happen to be very low. And for that reason, income has been extremely low for those countries that focused simply on producing agricultural goods or farming goods. So the standard of living has been maintained at a very, very low rate. And these countries wanted to get out of this. In other words, they wanted to escape this agricultural or this so-called agrarian poverty trap. So the best way to do it is simply to engage in ISI. Now, what went wrong with the ISI? And here I have listed a few things that you can see, which obviously made the ISI strategy not to perform as well as was expected. Number one, there was overprotection of infant industries. In other words, in order to embark on an ISI strategy, you have to protect your infant industries from competition, because it doesn't make sense for you to invest heavily in all these factories and all these industries if they are actually producing those goods at a higher price than the outside world. So in order for this to succeed, you have to protect them from foreign competition. And as a result, this overprotection of infant industries made things worse for these industries. Why? Because lack of competition. What do you think lack of competition would do? Anyone?
Monopoly.
Monopoly.
Yeah, that's one, monopoly. And what else? And what will that?
Terrible quality products because there's no substitution.
Exactly, right. Because, you know, you can, if you're being protected from foreign competition, then you become somehow lazy. You know, first of all, you're really not interested in being efficient. You're not interested in quality control. You're not interested in anything, simply because you know you're being protected from competition. And you know that the domestic market has to buy whatever you produce. Take it or leave it, in other words. You know, there is no other choices. So this overprotection obviously caused a lot of problems. Huge investment funds were actually channeled towards these inefficient industries. So you can see that a lot of the capital resources went to actually finance these huge industries that were inefficient to begin with. So you're just throwing good money after bad. That's exactly what was happening with this ISI strategy. Now, you know, you don't have a competitive advantage in producing TVs or cars or refrigerators or whatever it is that you're trying to produce at home instead of importing it from overseas. You don't have a competitive advantage. You're not efficient. Plus, your market is so small. So you don't have the luxury of large-scale production like other countries, because your market is very, very small. Your domestic market is very small. And this leads to inefficiency. And this leads
Professor,
to
I have a question.
Yes.
A few of these deficiencies that I'm seeing from this kind of relate back to what I've learned about a command economy. Was this a command economy during a command type of government planning and economic development during this period?
Yes, you can say that, absolutely, because first of all, in the MENA region, the only one who was actually able to invest in this huge project is the government, because the governments are the ones that have the funds. Small businesses can't invest in these funds. And as we all know, the private sector in the MENA region was extremely weak or non-existent during that period, during the 1960s. If it existed, it was very, very small, the private sector. So obviously the private sector, if it were asked to embark on the ISI strategy, they would, first of all, they would be overwhelmed. Second of all, they really don't have the funds to do it. So obviously the one who's going to do that is the government. And bureaucracy, bad planning, etc., all came to contribute to the weakness of the ISI strategy. Then the neglect of the agricultural sector. To make things even worse, the agricultural sector was completely neglected in terms of investment, in terms of reforms, in terms of incentives given to farmers, in terms of modernizing the agricultural sector. None was done to the agricultural sector. So what happened here? Well, you saw a lot of the people that were working in the agricultural sector started fleeing the agricultural sector and going to urban areas. That's where the jobs are. So the agricultural sector was completely killed. And this caused a problem. Why? Because now, who's going to be consuming the goods that the industrial sector was producing. If the agricultural sector was no longer there, with people not earning enough money to actually buy these products. So obviously this was a big problem. In fact, it would have been a lot better to strengthen the farming sector, and so that the farming sector can actually become the customer of the industrial sector, but that didn't happen. So a lot of people who fled the agricultural sector thinking that they will find jobs in the industrial sector were pretty much unemployed. Why? Because most of the techniques that were used in the industrial sector were capital intensive techniques and not labor intensive. This is another problem in the ISI strategy. Now you could have used ISI, but you could have tried to use that in terms of using labor intensive methods rather than capital intensive methods. So that's another weakness, another problem. And then, of course, the ISI created what we call the twin deficit, which obviously led to a financial crisis in many of these countries, which obviously forced them to borrow money from outside, etc. Now, what's this twin deficit? One, budget deficit, because the government was spending colossal amounts of money for this industrialization process. So this led to a budget deficit. And on the other hand, you had a trade deficit. In other words, the country was basically importing machineries, equipment, etc. from overseas, but they were not exporting anything because the agricultural sector was completely decimated. Before, they pretty much exported agricultural goods, etc. But now, the agricultural sector is completely decimated as a result of the ISI. So now they're really not exporting anything, but they're importing a lot in terms of machineries, capital goods to keep their ISI going. So this was a huge problem. When you have this twin deficits, that's going to cause financial difficulties for the countries concerned, and that's exactly what happened. So all of these obviously culminated in a financial crisis that ended the ISI experience in the early 80s. So you had this ISI experience starting from 1960 to about 1983, 84, 85, somewhere around there. Now, after that, we had our government officials or policymakers now have to actually go back to the drawing boards and try to find alternatives, because obviously this is not working well for them. And with the advice and recommendations from global institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, who recommended for these countries to abandon the ISI strategy and start a new strategy. And the recommendation was, why don't you try the export-led growth strategy, whereby you focus on producing those goods that you have a competitive advantage in and try to export those goods abroad. Now the goods don't have to be agricultural. They can be a mixture, agricultural, lightweight manufacturing. In other words, things that you feel you can actually produce at a lower cost at home and be able to export overseas. That's why this strategy is known as the export-led growth strategy. But before we go there, obviously we have to make certain changes. In other words, we can't go from ISI to export-led growth automatically. Doesn't happen. You have to set the stage for the new strategy. And in order to do that, you have to go through some structural reforms, some adjustments in the economy. And these structural adjustments and economic reforms, of course, started in the mid 80s, I would say probably 1983 to 1993. That's a decade, 10 years basically. And this phase of development in the MENA is usually described as the lost decade. Why? Because it's a period that was defined by slow economic growth due to falling oil prices. That's exactly what happened during that period. And major macroeconomic imbalances. Now remember, a lot of these countries, as they came out of the ISI, they found themselves deeply ingrained, if you will, in this macroeconomic imbalances. Part of those are unemployment, high rates of unemployment, high rates of inflation, budget deficits, and trade deficits. All of these things are known as macroeconomic imbalances. And not only that, one more thing can be added to those macroeconomic imbalances, and that is a lot of these currencies were actually overvalued for a lot of these countries, which made it extremely difficult for them to export their goods overseas. We will talk about the valuation of currencies later on, I guess in chapter 7. That's when we will bring in the foreign exchange market. And we will try to talk about why the currencies of the MENA region at the time of the lost decade were basically overvalued, which obviously put a lot of these countries at a disadvantage when it comes to exporting their goods overseas. So they really had to make adjustments to their foreign exchange rates. In other words, they had to depreciate or devalue their currencies in order to be able to sell more overseas. But we will talk about that later on as far as exchange rates are concerned. Anyway, so all these macroeconomic imbalances combined with the falling in the prices of oil put a huge burden, if you will, was a huge burden for the MENA region countries. And it was something that was not easy to get out of, basically. So you had this global institutions come in to actually give advice and recommendations. And again, the MENA region came under pressure from global economic institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, to adopt new economic reforms in order to achieve macroeconomic balance, because they felt that the only way out of this predicament that they found themselves in because of the ISI strategy was to make economic reforms. And these economic reforms hopefully will lead to macroeconomic balance, which will put the economy on the right track in terms of competing and in terms of becoming more efficient and exporting goods, etc. So you can't really get to the other strategy, the export-led growth, without putting your economic house in order, if you will. So that's basically the whole intention of making those economic reforms. They needed to put their economic house in order. So this required obviously huge spending cuts, mainly in consumer goods, especially when it comes to giving subsidies in terms of food subsidies. It has to be eliminated. Fuel subsidies, in other words, I know that in some of these countries, but one country I'm pretty much familiar with, which is Libya, you can obviously fill your car tank with gas by simply spending maybe, and here we're talking about, putting 12, 15 gallons of fuel in your car, and it would cost you probably uh, something like maybe $3, which you would require to purchase 1 gallon here, or probably sometimes it won't even buy you a gallon. But in Libya, I mean, $3 that could fill your car with gas, basically 15 gallons, $3. That's all. So fuel is being subsidized, that's for sure. So, according to the global institutions, a lot of these countries, they have to do away with all these subsidies on food, fuel, energy, such as electricity. Electricity also is basically, I mean, can you believe it that nowadays in Libya, no one pays for electric bills? Now you may say, well, how is that possible? Won't they cut their uh, electric lines? I mean, if you're not paying for it, no, it doesn't happen. The government will not do it because these are not private companies. These are public companies. They are owned by the state. And the state, of course, has not found a good way of actually collecting from electric users the money that they owe the government. So people owe the governments right and left, and nobody pays anything basically. So electricity, no one pays for electricity. Water, no one pays for water, and everything is free basically. Gas, as I said, well, what you need is $3, and you fill your car with gas. Rents, I mean, who pays rents? If you are actually renting from the government, you don't pay rent basically. Now, if you're
Is it that that number is still calculated and added up and still counted, or is it just that the government doesn't necessarily act as its debt collector?
Exactly.
So is it still there, and is that still a part of other calculations like in GDP and other types of velocities of money?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a very good question. Again, when it comes to GDP, who knows what the GDP is in all of these countries? You know how the GDP is calculated in these countries? Basically, on what the country is producing in terms of oil production. And then probably what they do is haphazardly, they will probably add 20% more to oil production, and that's your GDP. But who knows what the GDP is? Is this really calculated according to international standards, according to IMF and World Bank standards? I doubt it. Even though, the IMF and the World Bank, they have tried their best. And I'm not talking about all the MENA region, by the way. I'm just talking about some countries in the MENA region that obviously lack the wherewithal, if you will, to actually compute and measure GDP according to international accounting standards. It's very, very difficult. So, that's why you have to be very careful when you look at these GDP numbers. They're not very accurate, in other words. Now, even GDP in the US and other industrialized and advanced countries, they're estimates. They're not accurate. And they have a lot of flaws and limitations as well, as I'm sure that most of you have taken principles of macro, know what the flaws and weaknesses are when it comes to measuring GDP. But obviously, in the MENA region, it's taken at a much wider scale, if you will, and as far as errors in measurements, etc. So, I really don't put that much credence to the numbers, but we have to use numbers as a way of comparing, I guess. That's the only way. But other than that, and as far as um, their accuracy, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that those numbers are accurate. Absolutely not. Because I really need to know, first of all, how these numbers are being computed. And there is no transparency. And as far as that's concerned, nobody knows. So anyway, so that's the last decade. And it took about 10 years to make the necessary reforms that were needed in order to be able to embark on a new strategy. And as I said, even though the IMF and the World Bank helped in that strategy, but even the IMF and the World Bank found it extremely difficult to push these governments to try and make these reforms as soon as possible. It was a very difficult job, as some members of the World Bank and the IMF commented recently in one of the articles that was written by one member that was involved in recommendation or in formulating or helping reformulate policies for structural adjustment in the MENA region. And he was saying that it was very, very difficult to persuade these government officials or bureaucrats to actually be on the move and to make the necessary changes in the allotted time period given. Nobody would respect time, in other words, and this is a problem. Now we have the export-led growth. And I guess what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop right there because all we have is 3 minutes left. And I would like to use those 3 minutes or 2 minutes that we have. If anyone has any questions, we will continue with this next time. Anyone has any questions?
What are SOEs again?
Yeah, the state-owned enterprises.
Gotcha, that's what that stands for.
Yeah,
Okay,
state-owned. So these are businesses, organizations that belong to the government. Any other question?
For the writing assignment, when would you recommend us starting on it? Like how far should we read into the chapters, like up to chapter 4, and then start writing it? And for the group project, I sent you an email like for the group members. I was wondering when we'll get like the news about that.
Yeah, once I get everyone in, once I get all the groups in, then I will let you know.
For sure. And for the writing assignment?
For the writing assignment, it's up to you. I mean, you have the dates when you're supposed to be handing a rough draft if you want. Actually, it's not called a rough draft because you will be graded on that. And the grade will remain regardless. All what you will see is simply an improvement on the grade if you make the necessary changes. But, you know, the date for submitting the first version, you know that, it's already given to you. And it all depends when you want to start on it. You can start from now if you want. You can start, you know, getting the resources together, getting the data together, and you know, it's up to you when you want to start on it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other question? Okay, so I guess I better run to my other class right now. I have another one. And I guess I will see you on Thursday.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Professor, I have a quick question.
Yes.
If we are already in a group, do you want us to email you the group names?
Yes, you have to. You have to email me with the names of in your group.
Okay, sounds perfect. Thank you.
Let me look at the comments. I'm sure a lot of you had comments here. I didn't have the chance to look at them because I was busy going over the PowerPoint. I mean the notes, lecture notes, but let's see here. Okay.